Hello, everyone. Welcome to our Bay Area Skep Talk. Bay Area Skeptics is proudly present our monthly Skep Talk. We are Bay Area Skeptics, founded in 1982 and the oldest regional skeptical organization in North America. We are skeptical, meaning that we believe in critical thinking, logic, and rational thought. In the 1970s and 80s, prominent scientists Carl Sagan and magicians James Randi became concerned about the public science literacy and founded a movement called scientific skepticism, which encouraged just thoughtful evidence-based discourse in matters of health, education, consumer protection, and particularly in the investigation of extraordinary claims. Scientific skepticism embraces that ideal of healthy skepticism, using inquiry and evidence to dispel irrational thinking in society. We trust the scientific method, evidence-based thinking, and the innate societal value of civil discourse. Remember, you can follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and on Meetup for news and upcoming activities. Just give me a second. All right, this is better. All right, and just a reminder, we are on Patreon. Membership in Bay Area Skeptics helps support monthly talks and other activities, and we invite you to participate in making the world just a little more reasonable and spreading the word about what we do and why we do it. We are now on Patreon, which makes monthly donations very convenient and allows participants to gain some perks based upon their contribution levels, like specific discounts and free t-shirts to our skeptical events. Before I hand off to our speaker for the evening, I would like to remind you our Skep Talk for the next month. Next month, our speaker is Paul Lombardo, and we will be discussing the continuing relevance of America's eugenic legacy. Please be on the lookout for the details of this talk soon. So now I would like to invite our President, Jeannie Scott, for introducing our speaker for tonight.
Thank you, Ashil. A couple of years ago, friends from Colorado visited us and told us they wanted to get together with their nephew in San Francisco. Their son was especially close to this cousin as kids and even as adults. So the Coloradans, the nephew and I, spent a very nice afternoon in Golden Gate Park, and after a week or so, we bid goodbye to our friends and they returned home. Our guests were the distinguished biological anthropologist Darna Dufour, her husband Paul Patmore, and their son Keegan, who with luck are watching us now. Being alert skeptics, you probably picked up that our speaker tonight is the nephew of my good friends. But he's not been invited to speak tonight because he's Dr. Dufour's relative. He's here tonight because of last year's Christmas letter. Paul had included a link to a blog post Nick had written discussing 2 databases that he and his colleagues at Google had assembled to assist in the detection of deepfakes. This made me think that Nick would be a really interesting speaker for Bay Area Skeptics, so I pitched him last spring. Fortunately, he remembered me from that visit years ago to Golden Gate Park and agreed to speak for us. So it is my distinct pleasure tonight to introduce our speaker, Nick Dufour. Nick has a bachelor's degree in biology with distinction from Worcester Polytechnic Institute and a master's degree in computer science from Stanford with a focus on artificial intelligence and machine learning. Between earning his 2 degrees, he worked at MIT as a research assistant in Rebecca Sachs's Social Cognitive Neuroscience Lab, where he worked on projects applying fMRI technology to questions involving neurological responses of people with and without autism spectrum disorder, resulting in several publications. He continued these interests in brain function and behavior at Neon Labs, a San Francisco startup that researches, as their boilerplate online says, how the human brain responds to images and how that response translates to increased viewer engagement. This was good preparation for his current work at Google, where he has worked for almost 5 years. He's part of the team researching how to detect auditory as well as visual multimedia misinformation. And I'm sure he'll tell you much more about that as well as other projects involved in the production as well as detection of deepfakes. So without further ado, to coin a cliche, let me present Nick Dufour speaking on deepfakes, GANs, and visual misinformation. Nick, take it away.
Thanks so much, Jeannie. I really appreciate it. And I'm super excited to be here. So as Jeannie mentioned, my name is Nick. I'm a software engineer at Google Research on a team studying misinformation. Specifically, we specialize in multimedia misinformation, so things like photos, videos, audio, and so forth. Now, you've probably seen these. These are called deepfakes. They're the subject of this talk, or at least part of it. And these are what we call true deepfakes. They're videos that have undergone a face swap mediated by a neural network. These are the original deepfakes in the sense that the term was coined to refer to these kinds of fakes. Additionally, there's other kinds that have sprung up in the meantime. You may have seen these. These are human faces, but critically, none of these people actually exist. They're totally synthetic, and they were produced with a technique called a generative adversarial model, which we'll also talk about. But sort of collectively, these are referred to as deepfakes, along with a couple of other things. The term is sort of a catch-all in the press for any kind of advanced faking technique. And we're going to try to parse apart what they mean and how they work and so forth as we go along. The press has spoken quite a bit about deepfakes with varying degrees of fear or enthusiasm about what they mean for society and what they mean for public discourse and so on and so forth. But there's actually quite a bit more to this story that we're going to dive into. Particularly, visual misinformation is by no means limited to deepfakes. So as by way of an outline, we're going to start by going over deepfakes. I don't want to bury the lead, particularly their history, how they come about, and what their current state is. Next, we're going to talk about the underlying technology, how people actually make deepfakes with neural networks, and we're going to go over so-called true deepfakes and GANs, these general adversarial networks. There's other kinds of deepfakes, but we're going to focus in on these because these tend to soak up a bunch of the oxygen in the room, as it were, in public perception. We're going to talk about some interesting social effects that we've observed from the existence of deepfakes. And then we're going to try to look at manipulated media beyond just deepfakes. We're going to try to go beyond the hype that's associated with deepfakes and neural network mediated fakes, and see what exists in the wider world. We're going to talk about current research, the kinds of techniques that are being used currently and explored in academia and in industry. And then finally, the challenges going forward, like what sort of stands in the way to moving this field ahead as time goes on. So deepfakes. This guy, Chris Bregler, is our current team lead. And boy, a number of years ago, he published a paper. And in that paper, they used advanced computer vision techniques to manipulate what an individual in the video was saying. They called it video rewrite. This is back in 1997, and it's kind of an deepfake, like a deepfake ancestor, if you will. However, the first true deepfakes didn't really start getting going until after the deep learning revolution, hence the term deepfake. As near as we can tell, the very first use of the term and their inception as a technique was by a user on Reddit who was called Deepfakes. And they started a subreddit also called Deepfakes. And this is in September of 2017 at 9:27 a.m., which I always thought was unusually early in the morning for such an important event to take place. A couple of months after that, the very first publicly available implementation of deepfake technology became available on GitHub in December. Sometime thereafter, Reddit either banned this user or the user themselves deleted their account, but by that time, the cat was let out of the proverbial bag, as the saying goes. And since then, we've seen a really, really active online community spring up around deepfaking technology. They're always trying new things, and they're really actively supportive of people getting into deepfaking. So there's tutorials. There's now deepfaking as a service where you can pay someone who uses cloud technology to produce deepfakes. And now there's also phone apps, so you can just take your phone and point it at something, and it'll just produce a deepfake without any involvement on the part of the user with the actual nitty-gritty neural network aspects of deepfaking. We've also seen a huge variety of other GitHub repos emerge. And if you're not super familiar with GitHub, it's essentially a hosting platform where you can upload code and anyone can download and use it. So we've seen multiple of these open source repositories spring up where anyone, as long as they have the appropriate computer hardware, can download these programs and produce their own deepfakes from the comfort of their own home, using nothing more than a personal computer and probably a GPU. As this has been happening, there's been active academic research on techniques that are similar to deepfakes. And obviously, the researchers don't do this maliciously. They do this out of curiosity and in the hopes that they can use this technology for good purposes. And there's a huge variety of really impressive techniques, not only in the traditional deepfake sense where you do a face swap, but also what's called puppeteering, where you can take existing footage and kind of animate it differently. Now, as this has been going on, this has had the effect of driving the open source deepfake development. So this community I mentioned online, they've been taking these techniques and integrating them. So by way of an example, this was a paper that was published in May of 2018 on a new kind of a tweak to improve the performance of certain kinds of GAN models. And sure enough, it was then added to one of these online GitHub repos in June. So that's a time delta of less than 2 weeks, which is really sort of remarkable that someone has taken this technique published in an academic journal, or really on the archive, and they've added it to a deepfake repo with a remarkably quick turnaround. So as you might expect, because they're always improving, we see that the deepfake quality is increasing. Back in the good old days of early deepfakes, you really had to have precise conditions in order to make a good deepfake. You know, the person had to be looking at the camera, they had to have good lighting, they couldn't turn their face too much, they couldn't do anything crazy with their expressions and whatnot. But as time has gone on, deepfakes have become more robust and they can be deployed in a variety of different scenarios. You can see on the right, that's Elon Musk, who's been added to 2001: A Space Odyssey with all these crazy lighting effects, and it works just fine. So they've really improved quite markedly as time has gone on. Meanwhile, I mentioned this other technique, these GANs that generate wholly synthetic images. There's another one of those face examples, and they've kind of proliferated. So not only are there fake human face generators, but now there are GANs that generate fake cats. They generate fake hotel rooms. They generate fake horses that admittedly look a little bit creepy. They even generate fake eye makeup. And I discovered this recently. There's a website that you can go to that uses a GAN to generate fake snacks. I think this is taco meat Chex Mix, which sounds just delicious. If you're curious about these kinds of things, they're hosted on a website, www.thisxdoesnotexist.com. And this website isn't malicious. It's educational. It's designed to demonstrate the capacities of GANs to the general public and what they can and can't do. All that said, the press has varying levels of alarm, but many deepfakes are used for humor and satire. None of these are deceptive. They're kind of funny, right? The deepfake community, or the early deepfake community, really liked taking Nicolas Cage and putting him in weird movies, or in movies where he shouldn't show up, like as Amy Adams or as Jean-Luc Picard. And no one is fooled by this, right? There's no malice behind it. It's for fun. Deepfakes are also used for political speech, to make a political position, to illustrate a political position. In this case, this is the former now president of Argentina, deepfaked as Adolf Hitler. But again, this isn't deceptive, right? That no one's fooled by this content. However, it's not all non-malicious. By far, the biggest malicious use of deepfakes is for what we call non-consensual pornography. And this is almost exclusively directed at women. It's a technique to harass and demean women. And there's a number of different ways this occurs. In some cases, they'll take real pornographic films and they'll insert someone into it. So it'll make it look like this person who wasn't in the pornographic content initially is in the pornographic content. More recently, there's a phone app that someone produced that uses GAN technology to, you can take a photograph of a person and it reproduces that photograph only without that person wearing any clothes. So while initially there might have been predictions that, deepfakes were going to be used for these catastrophic events, and that hasn't really materialized, it doesn't mean that they don't cause harm today. So let's talk a little bit about how deepfakes work. I mentioned that there's a number of events or of techniques that have kind of been grouped together in popular discourse as being deepfakes, but we're going to talk only about two. The true deepfakes, the technique that was first proposed by the person who coined the term, and then GANs. I'm going to assume some knowledge, very basic knowledge of neural networks. By way of, in case you're totally unfamiliar, neural networks are mathematical objects that essentially learn things. That's a good enough way to put it for our purposes. So true deepfakes. These are these neural network mediated face swaps that you can see the example right there. So to make a deepfake, you need a couple of things. You need two people. One is the source and one is the target. The source provides the facial motion, and the target is the person who's going to be inserted into the footage, the person who's going to be deepfaked. You need a lot of pictures of both of these individuals, lots and lots of pictures, preferably making all sorts of facial expressions and from all sorts of angles and with all sorts of lighting to really capture the variance of this person in video footage. And then finally, you need a deepfake neural network. Now, deepfake neural networks have two basic components. They have what's called the encoder, and the encoder's job is to take an image and it transforms that image into a vector of numbers. Now that might sound a little bit abstract, but just bear with me, and we'll hopefully make it clear as time goes on. The second type of subnetwork in these deepfake networks is called the decoder, and it just does the reverse. It takes this vector of numbers and it converts it into an image. For our purposes, we're going to try to convert it back into the input image. So we take image, we get our numbers, and then we go back to the input image. And critically, there's far fewer numbers in this intermediate stage than there are bits in the input image. So there's compression happening here. The actual network, a true deepfake network, this is the original deepfake network or representation of it. It uses one encoder and it uses two different decoders. And now each one of those decoders will specialize in either the source or the target. So to concretize this, let's take an example. Albert Einstein and Ozzy Osbourne make a deepfake. I'm not certain that Ozzy Osbourne and Albert Einstein were friends, but I'm not a historian, so we can just kind of go with it. Now, to begin, they take this network, this brand new network, and it consists of all different variables, right? And initially they're random. They're just randomly assigned. They don't have any particular rhyme or reason. They're totally assigned at random. And we're going to kind of make this easier. Decoder A is going to specialize in Ozzy Osbourne, so we'll call it Ozzy's decoder, and decoder B will specialize in Einstein. It'll be Einstein's decoder. And to begin with, we take a photo of Ozzy Osbourne, we send it through the encoder, we get our vector of numbers, and then we give it to Ozzy's decoder, and we get something out. And it doesn't look very good. In fact, this, if anything, overstates how good it looks. In general, it'll just look like nothing at all. It'll just be noise or a gray square, just complete nonsense. But in order to make the network better at doing this, we have to be able to give it some kind of guidance. We have to teach the neural network or train the neural network. And because the neural network is a mathematical object, we do this mathematically. In this case, it's pretty simple. We just take every pixel in the output and compare it to every pixel in the input and see where it got it wrong. And we say, okay, adjust your weights to make this a little bit different and this a little bit better. And training proceeds like this. We show it images of Ozzy and of Einstein and of Ozzy and of Einstein and of Ozzy and of Einstein. And you can see that as we do this thousands and thousands of times, and each time we do it, we sort of adjust the neural network to make it a little bit better. The output images get closer and closer to the input images until finally, after say 40,000 training steps, the outputs are really good. They look almost exactly like the inputs. And at this point, you're actually done training the deepfake network. Now, you might be thinking, okay, thanks, Nick, but who cares? What's so special about that? And the reason it's special is because of a reason that I've actually omitted, because I find it's a little bit better to explain more concretely, which I'm going to do with hopefully a good analogy, but possibly a potentially overwrought analogy. If we go back to our deepfake architecture, let's actually say instead of an encoder, we have a poet. And this poet's job is to take a photo and then write a lovely poem about it. Now, critically, this poem has to be short, right? They say that an image is worth 1,000 words. But in this case, we're only going to give our friend Shakespeare 128 words to construct this poem. And that poem describes the input image to the point where if we give this poem to our artist, it's no longer a neural network, it's now an artist, they should be able to reconstruct that input image. They should take the poem, and it should be descriptive enough that they can then, paint the input image effectively. So we have our two artists for each of our two individuals. And it might start out with, say, we show a photo of Einstein to Shakespeare, and he writes a poem. Behold a man with wild hair and mustaches, blah, 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 blah. It's very fancy and it's very beautiful, but it might not be very good at describing what the photo is of. Now, we give that poem to Einstein's artist, and he's never seen Einstein before, right? He only has this poem to go on. So he draws something, but it doesn't exactly correspond to what Einstein looks like, or what the input image looks like. But we train them, right? We say, oh, you know what? Actually, he has a bit different hair, and this looks a bit differently. And then we show, Shakespeare how the painting turned out, and he goes, oh, gee, maybe I could have written this poem a bit differently. And that's how we train our individuals involved in this deepfaking effort. So as training is going on, Shakespeare's thinking, boy, how can I make these poems more effective? How can we make these poems produce better paintings from the artists, to be more expressive? And then Shakespeare has an idea. He notices that every time he has to write a poem about Ozzy Osbourne, he always gives it to Frida Kahlo. And whenever he writes a poem about Albert Einstein, he always gives it to Pablo Picasso. So the same artists always are tasked with painting the same people. And he reasons that, I don't have to describe the appearance of the person at all. I don't have to describe Albert Einstein's hair because Pablo Picasso has learned through thousands of iterations of painting Albert Einstein what Albert Einstein's hair looks like. Indeed, I only have to describe the stuff that's different about this particular image. I only have to describe the things that vary from image of Einstein to image of Einstein to image of Einstein, and image of Ozzy to image of Ozzy to image of Ozzy. So the effect this has is now, later in training, after they've all been doing this for a long time, the poems no longer contain anything about what the person looks like. They only contain the things that are specific to that image. So in this case, neutral expression and soft light, the face is turned slightly leftward, blah, 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 blah. Now, this results in a really good painting by Pablo Picasso, because Pablo Picasso knows what Einstein looks like at this point. He just has to draw him in the particular pose that's being described in the poem. And that's effectively that's how the deepfake network is trained. So after training is complete, Ozzy wants to create a deepfake, right? He has this clever idea. He's thinking about how this all works, and he goes, I think I can do something kind of clever here. So he takes this ridiculous photo of himself with his tongue out and gives it onto Shakespeare. And Shakespeare goes, oh, wild-eyed, mouth open, tongue stuck out, describes this crazy photo. And instead of giving that poem to Ozzy's artist, instead, they give it to Einstein's artist. And note that this description, nothing about it is specific or particular to Ozzy Osbourne. Anyone can make this expression, right? So now when Einstein's artist sees this, he goes, okay, that's a little bit out of character for Albert Einstein, but I can draw it just fine. And then boom, he outputs what's effectively an Einstein deepfake mimicking Ozzy. And this is exactly how deepfakes actually work. They do this precise thing where they train one network that's really good at making photos of your target, and you give them an input description of your source, who might be doing something ridiculous, and the output is you get a photo of your target doing that same exact ridiculous thing. So that's the original deepfakes. The other thing that I was going to describe, the other technique, is GANs, these so-called generative adversarial networks, and I'll explain why they're called that later. But a quick caveat, these kinds of generative models are probably best understood probabilistically, but we're just going to gloss over that because it's not super necessary to understand how they're actually implemented. So, quick question, can a neural network learn to recognize a cat? The answer is yes. I'm not going to beat around the bush. And by this, I mean we can train a classifier that takes a photo of a cat and it says, this is a cat. Or it takes a photo of something else, in this case, Saturn, and it says, this is something that is not a cat. That's not anything new, right? Everyone knows that that's something that neural networks are particularly good at. They've been doing that since 2012. But an interesting question is, can we reverse this process? Can we go from, say, a description of a cat, or just the word a cat, to a photo of a cat? Well, maybe. But what would the input be, right? Like, what would you give the neural network to produce that? It can't be the same thing each time. It can't just be the word cat. Otherwise, because the neural network is deterministic, you get the same photo of the cat every single time, and that's just not interesting. But perhaps more importantly, how do we train it? How do we teach this neural network to produce photos of cats? Sort of an open question, right? Because remember that these neural networks, they're mathematical objects. They need a mathematical description of how to get better. So it's not really clear how we have a mathematical description of if a photo is a good photo of a cat or not, right? Like you might ask, is there a Catniss function? And by what I mean by that is there a function where if we give it a photo of a cat, it gives us a high score, and if I give it a photo of something that isn't a cat, I don't know why I was on a planet kick when I made these, it gives us a low score. Now, one idea for this that's very, very clever came about in 2014, and the idea is you train your network to generate cats. At the same time, you train network to tell if the image is a real image of a cat or a fake image of a cat. And they call this the critic. Now, because it's a neural network, it's a mathematical function, right? And the way that this works is you give it a photo of a cat and it says, yep, this is a real cat. Or you give it a photo of something that isn't a cat and it says, this is not a cat. And again, we're also going to use a person for this because I'm a fan of personifying my neural networks. Since this neural network is a mathematical object, we can exactly quantify how it's thinking, right? We can take its outputs and turn them into mathematical feedback for our artist, our generator neural network. The way this ends up looking is we have random inputs, right? Just a random string of numbers. That's sort of our inspiration. It's the thing that lets our neural network kind of create a new thing each time. That gets passed to a generator, which is effectively equivalent to the artist from our previous example, and it outputs an image of a cat, or its representation of an image of a cat, which we then give to the critic, and it either says this is a real cat or this is a fake cat. Now, the generator, or the artist, it wants to create an image that looks like a real picture of a cat, right? That's its goal. And it's a generator. That's the generative in the generative adversarial network. At the same time, the critic, it's trying to learn to tell if the picture is fake or not. So we give it real photos of cats, and we give it fake photos of cats. And we want it to be able to say, to accurately determine if it's a real photo of a cat or not. That's this adversarial relationship that exists between the generator and the critic. And they go back and forth and back and forth and back and forth. And they get better during training. So the generator, the artist, gets better at making photos of cats, and the critic gets better at telling apart very, very realistic images of cats from real, true images of cats. It goes on and on and on. And I tried to select images, these drawings that were of varying quality of cats, but I don't mean to imply that the original drawings weren't very good, because they're already far better than I could draw. So that's these two approaches, these original deepfakes, and this other thing that's also referred to as deepfakes by the press called GANs. What about the social effects, right? So the press made quite a big deal about deepfakes and what they can be used for and their potentials for harm. But I don't want to say disaster that they forecast, but these significant effects, they haven't really materialized, right? But that's not to say that things haven't changed. Things are definitely different. There's been a lot that's happened because of these developments. One of which I already mentioned is that deepfakes are used to harass women. They're used to degrade women. And I mean, it's not gender specific, but all evidence suggests it's overwhelmingly directed at women. And we don't have, I can't personally validate the numbers, but there's been various third parties that have put this as high as 96% of all deepfakes are used for non-consensual pornography. But they're also used to create fake online personas. So there was recently, this summer, an instance where people were using GAN generative faces to create fake journalist personas on online websites to spread propaganda. Additionally, since the inception of visual deepfakes that produce videos, there's now audio deepfakes that can produce fake audio as well. And this is clearly a fake. This example of Bernie Sanders reading the Communist Manifesto. This is not meant to deceive anyone. Anyone who sees that, because it says speech synthesis in the name, it's not meant to be deceptive. However, also the summer before last, there was an instance of someone using a synthetic AI voice to defraud a company, and they did this by synthesizing the voice of their CEO, and then I think calling their CFO and just telling them to wire a bunch of money someplace, and they were actually able to get a couple of $100,000 off this company using this synthetic voice. Now, those are the sort of concrete things that deepfakes have been used to do to cause harm, but there's a really fascinating phenomenon that's happening that is due just the fact that deepfakes exists in the minds of the public. So by way of example, this is in Gabon in 2018. Their president, Ali Bongo, he was out of the country getting treatment for a medical issue, right? And he had been gone for quite a long time. So people started spreading rumors that maybe he was dead or maybe something had happened to him. And to quash these rumors, the government released a video of him speaking, just saying, I'm okay, everything's fine. But there were irregularities in this video. In fact, later, some people theorized that he might have suffered a stroke, and that's what the medical issue was, and that caused the video to appear unusual. But opponents of Ali Bongo, they claimed that Ali Bongo was dead, and that this video is actually a deepfake. It's totally synthetic. A week after the video came out, there was a military coup in that country, and the video was specifically cited as partial justification for why this coup took place. So this is a military coup that is predicated in part on supposing that video evidence that would have previously been very compelling is in fact a deepfake. And that's exactly what we see in multiple instances, where the fact that the public knows that deepfakes exist has enabled high-profile individuals to be able to say that previously compelling evidence is in fact fraudulent. It's not real at all. Chesney and Citron, in a foreign affairs paper, they termed this the Liars Dividend. So I guess you can think about it as deepfakes have made it easier for liars to lie. That's the dividend they get from this. And we haven't seen it just in Gabon. We've also seen it in Brazil in 2018, in China in 2019, in Malaysia in 2019. A lot of these involve sex tapes. And then in 2020 in Bulgaria. And this is the first example of a auditory evidence that's being claimed to be a deepfake. So I think a really fascinating thing that we've learned doing this is that the consequences of deepfakes and the techniques of deepfaking, they don't just extend to material real deepfakes, but also just the fact of their existence has had pretty substantial effects on public discourse. What about beyond deepfakes, right? I mean, I showed you this slide with the press talking about deepfakes, but as near as we can tell, deepfakes are a fairly small component of visual misinformation overall. So I thought maybe we could kind of go over a taxonomy of what we think the landscape of visual misinformation is and visual fakes is. So we can start out with deepfakes, and there's the true deepfakes. These are the ones that we've been talking about and we went over. And there's a bunch of other things that are also called deepfakes. One of them, GANs. We talked about those as well. There's also puppeteering, where you take real footage of someone and you make them do something that they weren't doing before. There's also these apps that let you do semantic editing. So you can take a real photo and tweak the smiling or the expression or the lighting, and that's called semantic editing. Interestingly, there's actually online apps and companies that let you do all these things. Now, I don't want to claim that any of these are done maliciously. Some of them are educational. Some of them, they restrict their product to only vetted individuals who they know won't do anything bad with them. But the fact remains that these are already technologies that are being productized and made available on the internet. Now, the kind of flip of the coin, or the other side of the coin, relative to deepfakes are fittingly called shallowfakes. And they're not called shallowfakes because there's, shallow in the sense that they're stupid or whatever. They're actually quite complex. So this includes things like industrial visual effects, which have been around for decades, creating fake video and fake audio industrially in a large corporation with teams of people who use really sophisticated techniques and 3D animation programs to do these kinds of things, and also Photoshop. So both of these techniques, they require lots of expertise, right? They're not easy to do by any means necessarily. They're shallow in the sense that they don't use a deep neural network to produce their outputs. Now, Photoshopped images are quite common. This is an example of Emma Gonzalez, who survived the Parkland shooting. And in the original image, she was tearing up a, I don't even know what you call it, like a shooting paper for a target range, but they replaced it with the US Constitution, right, to imply that she's destroying, she's shredding our founding documents and whatnot. And these kinds of images are often used to serve narratives. So in the previous example, we don't really know who made that image. It's spread online on Twitter, but there's also state-level actors who use Photoshop to serve narratives. This is an image from a state-sponsored Russian news network, and they took an image of Sergei Lavrov meeting Kim Jong-un, and they Photoshopped Kim Jong-un to be smiling, to look like he was happier than he actually was. So this is a state-level, or at least a state-sponsored media organization that's also using Photoshop to construct and kind of shape a narrative as they desire. A kind of subset of shallowfakes are called cheapfakes, and they're like shallowfakes. They don't rely on neural networks, but unlike things like Photoshop and industrial level visual effects, they don't require expertise either. There's a number of examples that have surfaced relatively recently of this. One of them is deceptive edits. In this specific example, it's a video of Nancy Pelosi, and they had kind of swapped around the video to make it look like she was stammering or stuttering. And it was actually tweeted by a certain well-known Twitter personality. And then a day later, there was another video also of Nancy Pelosi. This one was a little bit more sophisticated. They had taken existing video of her speaking at a conference and they slowed it way down. They just decreased the frame rate. But then they used pitch matching software so that her voice wouldn't have that really low kind of quality that slow video has. So she sounded the same, she just talked much slower, and it gave the impression that she was drunk. And this also made the rounds on the internet. Another interesting example is, and this is really like a kind of requires very little expertise. And this is a video of Jim Acosta at a White House press conference. And a White House intern tried to take the microphone from him because I guess he was asking an uncomfortable question. And what they had done is they just deleted frames from this video to make it appear like they were fighting with the mic or something, or like he was assaulting this White House press intern. So they're very simple methods. They don't require much expertise, but they can be effective at serving narratives or convincing people that what they depict really actually happened. The final class that we're going to talk about, we group under cheapfakes, but it doesn't necessarily belong under cheapfakes because it's not really a fake in the traditional sense. And this is called media repurposing. And this is a very challenging kind of fake. So in media repurposing, they take real media. They don't modify the media itself. So every pixel in the image, every frame in the video, every bit in the audio is real. It hasn't been modified, but they just claim it's something else. So in this example, we have a real photo of buses. Hasn't been doctored. It's a real, authentic photo of buses. And they're just claiming that it's buses filled with fake protesters off to protest something. And these protesters are being paid by some shadowy cabal. So again, the image is real. The only thing that's changed is the context. The media has been taken and repurposed to serve some other context, right? This happens a lot with election stuff. There's a subset of videos of ballot stuffing that were captured in Russia and the state, or the country of Georgia, and they're in like elections worldwide. They're repurposed, and they just say, "Oh my gosh, look, this happened in, this place in 2018, or this happened in Canada 2019. Look at and it's always the same thing. It's always video from years or even decades before that they've taken. They haven't modified it. They've just claimed it's something else. They've taken it and said, this is something that's happening today or that happened yesterday, when in reality it happened years ago. This kind of fake, this media repurposing, we think is the most common kind of visual misinformation. It's the easiest to create because you don't need to have any skills at all. You just have to take a photo from someplace or a video from someplace and say it's something else. And because of that, it's also very difficult to kind of automatically detect, as you might imagine, because nothing about the pixels have been modified. The data is all real and true. It's just the context that's been changed. So now that I've given you a taste of what the kind of landscape of misinformation looks like, what's going on in academia and industry to try to push back against this? So I'm going to start with some work that we did at Google. We collaborated with Jigsaw, which is another Alphabet company, and we filmed actors. We filmed consenting actors, 28 of them, in New York, in a variety of scenes. You can see some of them here, these naturalistic vignettes. They're mostly like office scenes and social scenes because we wanted to capture kind of realistic video. And again, critically, these actors were all consented, and we tried to get as wide a variety of scenes as possible. Then we took the open source repos that I mentioned earlier that are used to make deepfakes, and we replicated them in such a way that we could deploy them at scale. So we can make zillions of deepfakes really, really quickly and automatically. This would enable us to create gazillions of deepfakes, which can serve as a data set, as a base for training detection methods and mitigation methods. And that's exactly what we did. So we generated tens of thousands of deepfakes, I think more than 2 million frames in total. And critically, this is all using open source methods. So these kinds of deepfakes look just like the kinds of deepfakes you'll see in the wild. And that's really important, and we'll talk more about that in a bit. But this data set was released publicly to academics. It also was added to a larger data set called Face Forensics++ out of the University of Munich and the University of Naples. And we were really thrilled to see the uptake with this data set in academia, because there's so much enthusiasm for producing new kinds of deepfakes and new techniques in this open source community, we were wondering if we can kindle similar enthusiasm for detecting deepfakes in the academic community. And I think we've largely succeeded. It's been used in a number of instances and a number of papers, which has been really exciting for us. What about detection though? Like how do we actually detect these kinds of things? So we're going to talk first about defect detection, and I'm going to go over kind of chronologically how this progressed. The very first notable paper was out of SUNY Albany, and they noticed that in these deepfake videos, the people being deepfaked, they don't really blink very much. They just kind of stare, straight ahead like a zombie the whole time. And normal people, they blink, right? Everyone blinks all the time, more or less. So they reasoned that maybe we can look for discrepancies in blinking, and that will let us identify deepfakes. And sure enough, it worked. It was covered in the press. I suppose there was relief. Unfortunately, this effect was due to a sort of bias in the deepfakes, where initially people who made deepfakes online, they trained on these collections of images, and because they often deepfake celebrities, they would get these images from things like red carpet events. So if you think about photos from red carpet events, the people who are taking the photos, if they take a photo of a celebrity and the person's blinking, they just throw that photo out. They don't publish it, right? So it's not made available. So all the photos you can get of this type, they have, their eyes are wide, they're smiling, they're making, very normal expressions. They're not, half blinking or something like that. So the resulting deepfakes, they didn't have any of these effects either. They didn't have blinking because there's no blinking in the trained data set. So the deepfake network never learned how to produce blinks in the output deepfakes. The next kind of cool approach, and this isn't continuing with the using biological or biophysiological signals to detect deepfakes. This is built on some research that came out of MIT that I still find pretty remarkable, where you can take video of a person and you can infer their pulse from this video. It doesn't have to be with a special camera, it can be with a normal camera. And the reason is because as your heart's beating, you can actually detect tiny changes in the color of your skin as blood perfuses and deperfuses out of it during normal heart beating. And also, it turns out that your heartbeats actually produce tiny motions in your face, in your head, that you can amplify. And both of these approaches can be used to detect the pulse and to measure the pulse of a person in a typical video. Now, these researchers, they reasoned that, well, okay, so if that's true of a normal person, maybe a deepfake network won't pay attention to those kinds of things. Maybe a deepfake network won't exactly replicate the pulse effects in a normal human, because it might have changes in color due to pulse, but they might not be consistent across the face. They might be inconsistent or irregular or not correspond to any kind of pulse you'd see in a real living, breathing human being. And sure enough, they were able to train on this and find fairly robustly if a video had been deepfaked by looking at the pulse, by looking at these measures of pulse in video. This is a more robust approach than the blinking, but it's still not perfect. There's still no fundamental reason why deepfake networks can't learn to replicate pulse. They might do it, fairly soon for entirely benign reasons. So other approaches that use even more robust signals are always valued. In this case, this one by Hani Farid out of UC Berkeley, they use a different kind of signal. So remember, to make our deepfakes, we need to have two people. We need to have the person who's going to be faked, and then we need to have the person who's driving the fake. So the person onto whom the target's face is added. So we get the expressions from that person, and then we get the appearance from the other person. So the deepfake might be able to perfectly replicate the appearance of, say, Obama. But what this paper does is it tries to learn all the kinds of subtle motions that these individuals perform when they're talking, the kinds of things that are specific to them, that your actor might not be able to replicate as effectively. And because of this, it's a really robust way are one of the robust ways of detecting deepfakes, because better and better deepfakes, they can't ever overcome this obstacle. This obstacle is incumbent on the person who's you're using as your source video. Even if you have a perfect deepfake, they can create a perfect representation of the person you want to fool. If the person you're deepfaking onto does something that your target never does, boom, you're able to tell that that's a fake. There's also approaches that go directly at the problem. They don't try to use a proxy signal. They just take a pile of fake images and a pile of real images and train a network to discriminate between them. This is work out of the University of Munich and the University of Naples. And this is actually was done in parallel with Face Forensics++, which is a data set of multiple different faking methods to which our data actually was added. So the data that we produced, the deepfake data that we produced, has been added to this data set with all these other techniques and approaches, and is also being widely used in academia. Now, I spent all this time talking about deepfakes, but then I also try to drive home the point that deepfakes are by no means the end-all be-all of visual misinformation. So what about cheapfake detection? What about detecting things like Photoshops? And this is a sort of an older body of literature. I'll only go over one example of kind of cutting-edge research, but there's a lot going on in this field. So if you think about a digital camera, like the one in your phone, it has this sensor in it that's very, very precisely manufactured. And because it's so small scale, it can't be manufactured perfectly every single time. So it means there's tiny imperfections in this sensor, meaning the sensor responds to photons differently in different regions. And this produces a noise pattern. This noise pattern is unique to device. It's used in image forensics in things like courthouses, but you need to have thousands or hundreds of photos in order to compute it. It's called the PRNU, or the photon response non-uniformity. Some researchers out of University of Naples, Luisa Verdoliva and Davide Cozzolino, they had kind of a cool idea. They thought, well, maybe we can use a neural network to learn an implicit model of this kind of noise. And it's not real PRNU, but it's sort of close enough in that it has all the same properties as PRNU does. Namely, it correlates across the image if the image is taken with a single camera. And if there's parts of the image that weren't taken with that camera, you can kind of see it in the response of the noise pattern. And that's exactly what you're seeing in the images on the right-hand side, where I think a plane has been added to the image on the top and a person has been added to the image on the bottom. And indeed, you can see this irregularity in the noise pattern on the right. And then they can use techniques like expectation maximization to produce heat maps and to kind of localize these modifications automatically. And that lets them say effectively what regions of the image are manipulated. And that's really exciting. Even cooler is that this same approach appears to be quite general. In this case, it's working on deepfakes. This is Sylvester Stallone, I think, as the Terminator. And as long as you have other faces in the video to compare it to, you can use these kinds of techniques to potentially detect deepfaked faces. Now, as I said, there's lots and lots of approaches for doing this. I'm not really going to go into them, but there's lots of really cool techniques. Some of them involve exploiting differences in how JPEG compression is implemented on cameras. Others use neural networks to try to determine if images are consistent, within image consistency. So there's lots of research, lots of really exciting research, but there's no silver bullet. There's absolutely no technique, there's no method that is 100% guaranteed to work in all instances. In fact, most of these methods boast only modest accuracies. People expect it to work like on CSI, where it has 99% accuracy, but that's not the case. So in addition to the fact that the methods aren't 100% effective, there's plenty of other challenges facing this research community. It's sort of unlike other research areas in that it's so general. And I liken it to the universe. Like, I feel like we're dealing with this huge universe of fake things. And the research group is this little tiny dot, and that's accurate and to scale, this little tiny itsy bitsy thing. And we're struggling, or not struggling, but we're trying to allocate our resources as well as possible so that we can capture as much of this as possible. Another issue we call the domain gap, and I'll explain it using, again, a visual analogy, my favorite thing. So inside this bubble that you can see, that's sort of the universe according to artificial data sets, the data sets that we use to train our detectors and to train methods for detecting visual fakes. You know, the sun is shining, everything is wonderful, the performance of our methods is 99%, and unbeknownst to us, biases abound everywhere. Meanwhile, in the real world, it's quite a bit harder. There's quite a bit more variance, there's quite a bit much more complexity, the distribution is far more complicated and high dimensional, and much, much, much harder to model. Our goal is to be like this gentleman here, where we're able to break through out of this bubble and really capture what's going on in the real world. And that's not nearly as easy as it seems. I'm going to show you some example data sets, and my intention isn't really to call out anyone in particular, just to underscore how difficult this is. So this is a real data set. It came out in 2006, and its objective was to enable people to train splice detectors. So these are detectors that work on images that have had a region inserted, like they've just added something into the image that wasn't there before. And I'm going to show you an example image. And I know that there's probably not many forensic specialists in the audience, but see if you can spot the irregularity with this image. Exactly, it's the rubber ducky. And of course, I'm kidding. No one would ever see this image and think, boy, that sure looks like a realistic image. It's obviously fake. Here's another example. No human would see this and think that plant was hovering over that computer monitor. Now, this isn't necessarily a problem, right? I mean, this is quite a while ago, and it was more to show if their techniques could detect splices at all. But if we want to measure the performance of a network or a method that's designed to work on fakes that might fool a human, it's not terribly useful. In this sense, some data sets are designed to solve problems that no longer exist, or that don't exist anymore, or that never existed in the first place. And it's not to fault them, but the problem emerges if these data sets are still being used because there's a lack of new data sets being developed or a lack of innovation in the data set space. The second data set, it sort of underscores a more subtle point. So here are some example images from this data set. And you can see that, the real images on the top and the fake images on the bottom. And you can see they're done pretty well, right? They're not as obviously fake. So you can imagine the surprise of the researchers where they turned their models and their detection methods loose on this data set, and it just nailed it. It got it nearly perfectly. So after some research, they discovered something. When they saved the real images, they used one particular set of compression quality, but when they saved the fake images, they used a different compression quality. And the take-home message here is that these machine learning methods, especially neural networks, they're clever. If there's any bias in your data set, they'll pick up on it like that, and they'll exploit it. And that's not necessarily a problem, but if the real world doesn't also have this bias, the methods might perform very well in your data set, but completely fail in the real world. This is a huge problem, particularly in this domain where it's so hard to capture the distribution of fakes in the real world. The other challenge I want to talk about is called the Red Queen. And this is from, I think, Lewis Carroll. And she's this character, and she rules over this place where you have to run as fast as you can just to stay in place. This is, I know this from biology. I used to be a biologist back, seems like 100 years ago now, but the Red Queen hypothesis is essentially this idea about evolution, that evolution is driven not only by organisms trying to adapt to their environment, but also because the organisms against which they compete are also evolving and adapting. They're also getting better and improving, which means that you have to evolve just to keep up with everyone else. It's not enough to evolve to get better at finding food in the environment. You also have to evolve because someone else will evolve ahead of you and find your food and take it from you. So it's critical that these organisms evolve not just because, you know, the environment, but because of each other. And it's the same kind of thing with misinformation. If you want to be a fact checker and you want to be the type of person or the type of organization that pushes back against misinformation, the people who are producing fake content will adapt and they'll change to try to get around your mitigation methods. And it's something you have to be very, very aware of when you're doing this. And so to put it more bluntly, there's an arms race, right? There's an arms race between the people who want to push back against misinformation and the people who want to spread misinformation. Where does this leave us? Well, I don't know how you're feeling after this talk. You might think it's hopeless. You might be very hopeful. I'm hoping you're more hopeful, and I've prepared a couple of take-homes, or the things that are the most critical. That if you take nothing else from this talk, you take these from it. The first is that deepfakes will continue to evolve, and they'll continue to get better. They'll become harder and harder to spot, and this is being driven in part by the academic community. But it's also being driven by a very clever online community that's passionate about producing deepfakes, and they're very, very clever. And they're using all sorts of different methods to produce better and better deepfakes all the time. The second thing, and even more importantly, is that deepfakes don't need to be used in large-scale events to be harmful. There's all sorts of effects that we're seeing, societal effects that are taking place that aren't the result of large-scale catastrophes having to do with deepfakes. They're more subtle, and we need to be aware of them. Also, critically, deepfakes are not the only kind of misinformation out there. Even though they're hyped by the press, there's lots and lots of other kinds of fakes. Those are the majority of fakes, and they're just as damaging as deepfakes can be. Some kinds of fakes, they're really simple. They don't need a sophisticated team of Photoshop experts or a neural network to produce effectively. They can be effective just with these kinds of dumb modifications that anyone can produce at any time. There is no silver bullet. However, there is this adversarial relationship. So if we end up developing something that seems like a silver bullet, you can rest assured that months or years later, it won't be as effective anymore because of this arms race phenomenon. But finally, there is an unprecedented level of research, and it's increasing. This community is getting larger and larger and larger all the time. That's doing research on this and is making really, really impressive strides to addressing this misinformation. So while this talk might have been occasionally pessimistic, I am overall hopeful that we'll be able to address this problem better and better in the foreseeable future. The very last thing, if anyone in the audience is interested in this as an issue and has experience in machine learning and natural language processing, we're hiring. Shoot me an email and I'll send you a pointer to the application. We'd love to have you apply. And that's pretty much it. Thank you so much for listening, and I hope you found this informative.
Excellent. Thank you very, very much. That was really fun. I kept sort of reaching over and writing some little notes because, as you say, when you just think about the deepfakes and you think about the complexity and the impressiveness of the technology that's been developed so far, you really begin to think, is there any hope? But there's so many other ways to be fooled. I'm actually pathologically optimistic. I'm kind of like you. But knowing that there are shallow fakes and cheap fakes and all these other kind of fakes in addition to deep fakes, in a way kind of gives me hope, because there are techniques that have been developed. You talked about some of them, and from the skeptic community, we've been looking at Photoshop for a long time. There's this wonderful cartoon that maybe you've seen as well, but it's quite popular in skeptic circles, where it talks about the alien visitation evidence, invention of photography goes up. you know the one I'm putting here. Invention of Photoshop goes way up. But there are ways of detecting a lot of these kinds of fakes, and as you say, there's a literature on this. So, I'm optimistic too. I think that smart people thinking hard about this. Yes, it's an arms race. I do understand that. I'm a biologist too. The Red Queen hypothesis lives, but it's also possible to counter some of those techniques that are being developed. And some of it is just fun. Some of it is just fun. But I think your admonition to us to be careful, because it can very definitely be used for some very negative things. So Ashiel, how are we doing on questions? I invite everyone who wishes to ask questions, or if you have a concise comment that you would like to make, not the paragraph long ones, but please, this is the time to do it. And Ashiel will let me know what they are, and we'll see what Nick has to say in response.
I want to say to your point about.
Oh, go ahead. Finish. Jay will wait. He's a good sport.
To your point, I mean, you think fakes have been around essentially since the inception of photography, and the world has yet to end. So that in of itself is a pretty good reason to be hopeful, right? Like you say, since photographs have existed, they've been making fake UFOs, but things haven't gone quite far south yet.
Yes, exactly. All right. The first question, please. Jay, your massive database of deepfakes can also be used for training labeling. You want to comment on that? I don't know what labeling is. You might want to explain that.
I'm not sure if you mean labeling as in classification, like telling if it's fake or not. If so, that's in fact the intention of this. We produce this data set of deepfakes so that academics can train detectors that can take images and label them either as fake or as real, which we call, labeling.
Okay. I didn't know whether that was a technical term that I wasn't familiar with, so that sounds good. Can we have the next question, please? Sheila is typing madly in the back here. The large deepfake database can be used as easily for training on detection as bypassing detection. Can we ever win this arms war?
Yes, this is an excellent question. And this is something we think about a lot. So what he's saying essentially is that theoretically, if we can use this data set to perform detection, a bad actor can also use this data set to evade detection. And I guess the right now, our method for getting around that is that we only release these data sets to vetted individuals, to academic researchers. We don't make them freely available in the hopes that bad actors will have trouble accessing them. But more broadly, this is a question that will be pretty vital going forward, and there's no real way to get completely around it. Anytime we release information to the public, anyone does, doesn't have to be in industry or in academia, they're potentially enabling fakers and bad actors to do their job better. So it's an open question that there's been a lot of great thought about, but it's by no means the settled issue.
Mm-hmm. When you release a database like that to an academic institution, say, are there controls as to who can use it, and are there records kept as to who is using it? I mean, how do you control it under those circumstances?
Yeah, they effectively apply to get access to it, and we keep records of those applications. Got
it. Okay, thanks. Next question, please. How useful is it to be suspicious of all media?
I don't think it's very useful. I think that a really great and undervalued tool is media literacy and teaching media literacy, like organizations like the Bay Area Skeptics. I don't think that most media is faked at any rate, and that there are certain kinds of cognitive tools you can adopt that can help you sort of audit if what you're seeing is to be believed or not, or bears further investigation. So the short answer is I don't think it's useful to be suspicious of all media, but you should think critically about it.
Internal consistency is always one of the best criteria to apply. Next question, please. Can we have a content database where original content can be registered and watermarked as authentic?
Really good question. There are some, this is something that people are pretty excited about. There's a couple of terms for this. One of them is provenance from the get-go. So essentially you make sure that when media is created, it's entered into a method to track it or to verify it or to keep it verified as time goes on, it gets modified and passed around. Adobe has work around this, the Adobe Content Authenticity Initiative. As you might expect, there's been a number of proposals involving blockchain, but whether or not those are effective remains to be seen. I guess the bottom line is that this is certainly a promising idea and maybe where we have to go in the future as fakes get better and better and better. But right now it will require a societal change, a cultural change, which is sort of too big an ask at this time, although it is regarded as a promising future endeavor.
Next question, please. Do you see every video on YouTube, Facebook, etc., getting a label of % likelihood of fakeness, or everyone sees and just a few who seek know the truth?
Well,
that's an interesting.
I can't obviously speak about YouTube or Facebook policy, but if we think earlier about the so-called Red Queen hypothesis, anytime you put that kind of information into the public, you're effectively enabling fakers to do A/B testing, to say, okay, well, I'll just keep on uploading more and more and more until I get that fakeness score down. So that in and of itself is a pretty good reason not to surface those kinds of scores. The way that kind of information is sent back to the user will have to be more sophisticated and more well thought out, that it doesn't help out any potential bad actors.
Next question, please. What is being done about labeling fakes when they are found?
Good question. So
And
I
by
don't know policy in particular, but again, this is a complicated issue. There have been studies done by psychologists that have shown that doing this kind of labeling might not be super effective, and the optimal way to relate this information is still sort of an open question.
Next question, please. Why can't a deep neural net be used to fake time series features to mimic head motion, gestures, etc. of the original subject onto the deep fake?
They can. It's just much harder. So we don't really see it. But there's no reason in principle why it can't happen.
Just that it's a lot of work.
Exactly.
Okay. Well, we've come to a reasonable end of our program today. You've been very generous with your time. We really appreciate it so much. Thank you very, very much, Nick, for your time and your knowledge and your presentation. I found it fascinating. So did a lot of people tonight. You reached a lot of folks with some very interesting and important information. So we thank you again.
Awesome.
For everyone else, be sure to come back a month from today on the second Thursday of January and hear Paul Lombardo, who is a distinguished historian who's made for decades, he's been studying the American eugenics movement, has many extremely fascinating insights into this problem that is a historical problem, but also a scientific problem. Remember, eugenics was presented as a scientifically supported set of ideas back at the turn of the century in the first few decades of the previous century. So join us next month. And Nick, thank you again very much. Everyone else, see you next month. Good night.